In the early months of 2026, as the world's attention is gripped by escalating military operations in Iran, a new shadow is lengthening over the Caribbean. For 67 years, the island of Cuba has remained a defiant outlier just off the American coast. But recent rhetoric from Washington suggests the status quo is no longer an option. President Donald Trump has issued a series of blunt warnings, suggesting that Cuba's communist government is in its last moments of life and could soon face a friendly takeover, or something far less diplomatic if a deal isn't reached. With the recent capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro by U.S. forces, the primary lifeline for the Cuban economy has been severed, leaving the island, in the words of the White House, down to fumes. As high-powered political figures like Marco Rubio take center stage in managing these tensions, the question reverberating through global capitals is no longer if Cuba will change, but how is Cuba truly America's next geopolitical target? Or are we witnessing the final act of a Cold War drama that simply refused to end? Section 2. Why Cuba matters geopolitically. To understand the weight of these tensions, one must look at a map. Cuba sits a mere 90 miles from the shores of Florida, a geographic reality that has dictated American foreign policy for over 2 centuries. During the 19th century, American statesmen like John Quincy Adams famously compared the island to an apple that, if severed from Spain, would naturally gravitate toward the North American Union. Throughout the Cold War, this proximity transformed the island into the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth, serving as a forward operating base for Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. Even today, despite the massive power disparity between the two nations, Cuba remains a strategic pivot point. It is the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico and sits astride critical maritime trade routes. For the United States, a hostile or unstable Cuba isn't just a diplomatic annoyance. It is a potential platform for rival superpowers, specifically Russia and China, to project power and gather intelligence in America's near abroad. Section 3. Historical background. The current friction is the latest chapter in a long history of singular intimacy and deep-seated resentment. The modern rift began in 1959, when Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed government of Fulgencio Batista, nationalizing billions in American assets and establishing a communist regime. The American response was swift and enduring. A comprehensive trade embargo established in 1960 that remains the centerpiece of U.S. policy. To this day, the 1960s saw the relationship descend into open hostility, from the failed CIA-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs to the 1962 missile crisis, which brought the world to the precipice of nuclear war. For decades, Cuba was viewed as a loyal proxy of the Soviet Union, intervening in conflicts as far away as Angola and Ethiopia. While the presidency of Barack Obama saw a brief Cuban thaw starting in 2015, restoring diplomatic ties and easing travel, most of those steps were later rolled back. By 2026, the temporary warmth of that era has been replaced by a renewed frost, as Cuba finds itself once again designated as a state sponsor of terrorism and subjected to maximum pressure. Section 4. Recent developments. Recent months have seen a dramatic escalation in both rhetoric and incident. In early 2026, the Trump administration declared a national emergency regarding Cuba, signing an executive order to impose tariffs on any country supplying the island with oil. This move was coupled with the claim that Havana maintains links to extremist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, representing an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. On the ground, tensions turned lethal in February 2026, when a Florida-flagged speedboat reportedly attempted to infiltrate the island's north coast. Cuban authorities claim the vessel's occupants opened fire on soldiers, leading to a confrontation that left 4 people dead and resulted in terrorism charges against 6 survivors. Meanwhile, high-ranking U.S. officials, including Senator Lindsey Graham, have doubled down on the narrative of regime change, stating publicly that after Iran is dealt with, Cuba will be next. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is now reportedly handling discussions with Cuban leadership, with reports suggesting that the future of President Miguel Díaz-Canel and the Castro family themselves are on the negotiating table. Section 5. Cuba's internal situation. Inside the island, the situation has reached a breaking point. Cuba is currently suffering through its worst economic and social crisis in recent memory, characterized by chronic shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. The electrical grid is in a state of near collapse, with repeated blackouts forcing residents to cook over charcoal as thermoelectric plants struggle to stay online. Inflation is rampant, and the government has been forced to reverse bans on U.S. cash deposits just to keep the economy from total seizure. This internal instability has triggered a massive migration surge. U.S. authorities encountered approximately 600,000 Cubans at the southern border between 2022 and 2024 alone. President Díaz-Canel has decried what he calls an energy blockade by the United States, accusing Washington of a psychological war aimed at forcing the population into submission through extreme living conditions. The desperation is palpable, with students staging sit-ins at Havana University as classes are slashed due to the energy crisis. Section 6. U.S. Strategic Interests. So, why is the United States ramping up the pressure now? The answer lies in a mix of domestic politics and regional strategy. The Cuban-American diaspora in Florida remains a potent political force, maintaining significant influence over successive administrations' policies. For many in Washington, the capture of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela in early 2026 was a catalyst. Without Venezuelan oil and money, Cuba's leadership is perceived as uniquely vulnerable. There is also the persistent issue of migration, which the U.S. sees as a security risk that can only be solved by addressing the root cause: the Cuban government itself. Furthermore, ideological conflict remains a powerful driver. The Trump administration has characterized the Cuban government as one of the few remaining outposts of tyranny, and there is a clear strategic desire to prevent Havana from serving as a gateway for adversaries to enter the Western Hemisphere. Section 7. Role of other global powers. The geopolitical chess match is further complicated by the presence of other global powers. As U.S. sanctions have tightened, Cuba has naturally looked toward Moscow and Beijing for survival. Russia has periodically projected its military force into the region, with warships docking in Havana as recently as June 2024 for naval exercises, a move seen by many as a message to Washington over its support for Ukraine. China, meanwhile, has been linked to reports of building eavesdropping stations on the island to intercept military communications, and Cuba has officially joined Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. However, analysts note that these relationships are often more symbolic than substantive. China has expressed frustration over Cuba's inability to pay its debts, and Russia's ability to provide a meaningful economic lifeline is limited by its own international commitments. Nevertheless, the mere prospect of a permanent Russian or Chinese military footprint 90 miles from Florida is enough to keep U.S. military planners on high alert. Section 8. Possible future scenarios. Looking ahead, analysts see 3 primary paths for Cuba: The first is a continuation of maximum pressure, leading to further economic contraction and perhaps internal collapse, which could trigger an even larger migration crisis. The second is the deal that President Trump has frequently mentioned, a negotiated political transition where the current leadership steps aside in exchange for an end to the embargo and possible security guarantees. The third, and perhaps most volatile, is an escalation of tensions into direct military confrontation, a scenario that U.S. officials say they wish to avoid but haven't explicitly ruled out. While some experts at the Quincy Institute and other think tanks advocate for a pragmatic engagement to pull Cuba away from Russia and China, the current momentum in Washington appears to be swinging toward a final push for regime change. Section 9. Global Implications. The stakes of this confrontation extend far beyond the Straits of Florida. A crisis in Cuba risks destabilizing the wider Latin American region, where many governments already view U.S. sanctions as an archaic violation of international law. The UN General Assembly has consistently voted by overwhelming majorities to end the embargo, and a perceived naval blockade on the island could further strain U.S. relations with key partners like Mexico and Brazil. Moreover, the outcome will be a test of U.S. foreign policy credibility in an era of great power competition. If the United States can force a friendly takeover, it may reassert its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. If the effort leads to a failed state, it could create a security vacuum that rivals are all too eager to fill. Is Cuba America's next target? The evidence suggests that for the first time in decades, the pieces are in place for a fundamental shift in the relationship. With its regional allies weakened and its internal economy on fumes, the island is facing a moment of existential peril. Yet, as history has shown, Cuba has a remarkable ability to endure under pressure. Whether this leads to a friendly takeover, a new era of diplomatic engagement, or a dangerous escalation remains the central geopolitical question of 2026. As the drums of war beat elsewhere in the world, we must keep a close watch on the Caribbean, because what happens in Havana in the coming months will likely define American foreign policy for the next generation. What do you think? Is the age of the Cuban Revolution finally coming to an end? Or is this just another chapter in a century-long standoff? Let us know in the comments.